Hello everyone and welcome to this Hasselblad webinar. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Mark Whitney, part of Hasselblad's global marketing team, and I'm going to be joined by my colleague Chris Hughes, who's Hasselblad's global technical communications manager. Today's webinar is on the X system, and the two topics we're going to be covering today are the XH adapters and leaf shutters. Just before we get onto that, let's just go through a few of our standard slides. So just to let everyone know that this webinar and also our past webinars are uploaded to the Hasselblad YouTube channel following the webinar. So if you wanted to watch this webinar back, or you want to see any of our previous webinars, they're all on the Hasselblad YouTube channel, so you can find them on there. Also, this being an X system webinar, we did do a previous X system webinar back in October 2021. So for some other topics that you might be interested in, you can also find that on the Hasselblad YouTube channel. So we've covered the using the HTS 1.5 adapter with the X system, how the auto ISO works, the V system compatibility for the CFV 250C that comes with the 907X camera, how you can configure the electronic viewfinder, and also the functionality of the 907X control dial. So as I say, if that's of any interest after today's webinar, you can find that on Hasselblad YouTube channel. So for today, quick agenda. So we're going to be looking, as I said, at two main topics for the X system. That's the XH adapter and the XH converter 0.8. So we're going to be looking at the differences between these two options, and also the compatibility of the adapters and any possible limitations that you might come across. We'll also have a quick look, take the opportunity to have a look at some of our other adapters that we've got as well. So that's the XV adapter for using V system lenses, and also the XPan adapter for using the XPan lenses on the X cameras. Then we'll have a look at leaf shutters. So how does a leaf shutter work, and the differences of a leaf shutter compared to focal plane shutters, and what are the real life sort of practical benefits of using a leaf shutter. So hopefully that will provide some more information on that topic. As always, the approximate running time is about 50 minutes, give or take, and that should give us a bit of time at the end for some question and answers. Now, you're able to ask questions throughout the webinar using the GoToWebinar control panel down the side of your screen. Please only ask questions relating to today's topic, and we'll try to squeeze in as many questions as possible, either as part of the conversation or at the end of the webinar. So, Chris, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Mark.
So you're actually coming to us from Gothenburg today, from our head office?
Yes, actually in head office, which is a nice change.
Okay, and what's the Swedish weather doing today?
Actually, it's beautiful sunshine, which is very nice and acceptable.
Okay, good. Yep, so I've thrown over control to you if you want to share your...
Yep, thank you very much. Okay, so hopefully you can now see my secondary screen. So in terms of X mount, as Mark has just described, today we'll run through as many as we can. So we'll start with XH adapter. Then we'll look at the differences between that and the converter 0.8, and then a quick overview of the XV adapter and XPan. So starting with the XH adapter, this is the simplest of the two. Effectively, it's a spacer that sits between a H lens and an X camera body. So with the adapter, obviously you've got the choice of the 907 camera or X1D2, X1D Mark I. And then to that, you can then mount pretty much any of the 12 H system lenses. In terms of functionality, depending on the firmware version you've got and the lens exposure unit will control things like the shortest shutter speed and whether AF works and so on. And we'll talk through how to work out what functionality you can expect in a moment. So by using this particular XH adapter with a H system lens, because the HC lenses are designed to cover the larger 53 by 40 millimeter sensor, or in fact 645 film, you actually get a crop multiplier, so you get a longer focal length. So it's a 1.21 times multiplier. So Here you can see the fixed lenses. I haven't put the zoom in, but just the fixed lenses. So your 24 ends up as a 29mm and so on along there. If we look to the converter 0.8, the difference here is that you get a focal length reduction. You get 2/3 of a stop speed increase in terms of the aperture. But most importantly, you get an angle of view which is close to the angle of view you'd have had if you were using this particular adapter on a H6D with the 100 megapixel 53 by 40 millimeter sensor, so the larger sensor. And the way it works by bringing down the image circle to cover the smaller sensor means you actually get an improved lens performance as well. So this particular image is what we would capture through a 100 megapixel H6D sensor using the 100, in this particular case, 100 millimeter lens. So you can see the field of view here. If I was to fit the basic XH adapter, as I just explained, you get a focal length increase 1.21 times. So you then get a cropped field of view from the original lens's image circle. So you can see that effect here. With the 0.8 converter, you bring that full field of view back into use and we get that little speed increase. So this particular lens, if we were shooting at 2.2, we would get the equivalent of f1.8 aperture, but with the same field of view we would have had on the bigger sensor. So you retain that field of view, angle of view. So that is the main difference between the two adapter and converter. Basically, one is a simple adapter which allows you to mount H lenses, but you do get that crop factor, that basically 1.21 times multiplier. With the converter, you get the full angle of view you would have had on the bigger sensor, and you get a 2/3 of a stop speed increase. So here we can see in terms of focal length comparison. So starting here, say with the 24mm, with the converter, we end up with a 19.5 millimeter focal length. So we've got that shorter focal length effectively. The standard XH adapter, as I say, which is effectively the basic spacer, gives us a longer focal length. So if you had both adapters in your kit, with every H lens that you've got here, effectively you'll have a longer and a shorter focal length to work with. Those looking for a real shallow depth of field, the 100mm 2.2 lens would, as I say, give you a 1.8 with an 80mm focal length equivalent. Even the standard 80mm lens becomes a 2.2 and a 66mm, so just a little bit longer than standard. So what do you need in the camera to actually be able to use these adapters and then the H lenses on that? The X camera itself must have, if it's an X1D Mark I, 1.25 or later. And the X1D Mark II and the 907, it needs to be 1.4 or later in terms of firmware in the camera body. The differences occur as we then look at the different lenses within the H system range. So you can mount all of the HC and HCD lenses onto the cameras. However, if you've got a 120mm lens and the firmware is older than version 18, unfortunately, the camera won't accept it. You won't be able to use that. It's only version 18 or later. If you've got firmware version 18 to 19.03, you need to upgrade to 19 or later, basically to enable the autofocus functionality. Unfortunately, if you've got very old lenses from early 2000s, it might be before version 18, and unfortunately we can't actually upgrade those. You can still mount the lenses and physically use them, use the shutter in them, but manual focus with focus peaking and magnification is the only option you'll have. You won't be able to get autofocus. Okay. In terms of how do I check where this version is, what lens version have I got? A couple of different ways. So if you're using a H60 or if you're checking the version on an X1D camera, we start off, you go to the main control screen, and then we go to the general settings icon. So that's the cog. And then we need to go to the service about icons. And when you go in there, you'll have the camera version, the lens version, etc. And obviously on a H60, you'll also have the viewfinder version. If you were looking on a X1D or a 907, obviously the viewfinder is missing. You'll just see the firmware and lens firmware. So you can see this particular one's is a version 18. So this we could upgrade to 19.3 and above. So basically we could then turn on autofocus. If you're using H3, H4, H5D, basically you can check through the grip menu. So this obviously is H3. On H5, you can then press the same button, so menu button. Once you do that, you'll then get into the menu system on the grip, and then you can use the scroll wheel to move around to get to system status. Press enter, and when you get that, you'll get a couple of pages of information. So you'll get the body firmware, the magazine firmware, etc., and then the lens version here. So unfortunately, you can see this particular one is a version 17. So this, although we could use the lens, we wouldn't be able to use autofocus. We'd have to stick to manual focus. Okay. In terms of the other adapters, the XV adapter, again, is a basic spacer type adapter. And you can mount onto that pretty much every V System Zeiss lens. Unfortunately, we're not able to use the leaf shutters that are in those lenses. So you have to switch on the electronic shutter mode within the X camera, and it will be manual focus. But again, you can use focus peaking to help you, or focus magnification to enable you to get the image in focus. And again, because these lenses are designed to cover 6x6 film, there will be a crop factor in terms of the sensor being that bit smaller. So whatever focal length is marked on the lens, you'll get that 1.21 increase. Finally, you've got the X-Pan adapter. So with these ones, basically there were three lenses. So you had the 30, the 45, and the 90 lenses. They were manual focus lenses and manual aperture. That's still the case, I'm afraid. So basically with the X-Pan adapter, once again, you'll have to have the electronic shutter mode switched on, and then you can use the magnification or focus peaking to help you manually focus the lenses, and you'll also have to select the correct aperture, so it'll be manual exposure. Okay. That is quite a quick overview there, Mark, on terms of the adapters. Any questions on those? Probably more questions on XH and XH converter, I expect.
Yes, we've got a few questions. So Jeffrey is asking, are there any differences between the two adapters when it comes to things like bokeh and any other sort of characteristics of the adapters in terms of image quality?
No, so basically the XH adapter, you're literally cropping the center of the image. So if you imagine with this, the lenses are giving you a 70mm image circle roughly. And so you're taking a 55mm diagonal from the center of that image circle. So if you like, you're using the sweet spot, the good section of the lens in terms of the image circle. So image quality wise, you're using that really good center area. In terms of anything else, no, not really, because you're getting a focal length extension. There's no aperture change or so on, but you are getting that focal length, so therefore your depth of field is going to be slightly different. but in general, it's just a basic adapter to give you effectively the spacing that the H body used to give you. So it's a very basic adapter. The problem is that with that focal length extension, even if you were using the 24mm wide angle, you've still not got as wide an angle as you used to have on your H camera. So that's primarily why we then designed the, if I just switch back to it, the 0.8 converters to enable us to bring in that image circle to match the sensor diagonal. And so therefore you keep the field of view that you actually bought your original lens for. You get that field of view back in. And as a plus point, you get a 2/3 of a stop aperture increase, and a brighter image and a flatter image across the whole sensor plane. So if you like, the outer edges of the image circle, which on any lens are always of a lower quality, shall we say, than the exact center, as with every lens. By bringing in the image circle to fit the sensor, you're actually flattening the field of view. So you actually get a nice flat field of view across the whole image plane and a brighter image. So that's where we get the speed increase from.
Okay, great, thank you. And in regard to the firmware of the H lenses, Alan asked a question relating to how to update the H lenses firmware. So you can do that through an H body, is that right? Could you also do it through an X1D body?
You can do that for an X1D, so exactly the same way as you would do. Let me just jump to, sorry, bear with me. So if you're in service mode, you have the ability to then do a firmware update. And then if you download from our website the version 19.03 or above firmware, you can then put that onto your SD card. And then when you do firmware, it will check the SD card for the updated firmware. And then it will say, do you want to load it? And it will then update the lens.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see. When using the adapters, is there any difference to the speed of the autofocus on the X camera?
Yes, so compared to XCD lenses, so if you like, the motors in the XCD lenses are specifically designed for the mirrorless camera body and the speed that it can operate. The motors in the H body operate in a slightly different way in terms of the gearbox functionality and so on. So there's a slight difference in the drive speed of the lens, but it's a small amount. It's not a massive amount that you would think, oh, that's very slow. It's just a tiny amount, but there is a slight difference.
Okay, and with the XV adapter, is it possible to trigger the shutter in the V lenses, or will it ever be in the future, do you think?
At this point, there is no way of actually triggering that shutter, which is why we then need to use electronic shutter mode on the camera body, unfortunately. In the past, we've had the CF adapter, which allowed you to use the V lenses on a H camera. But at this point, it's not been implemented to be able to trigger that shutter. It's something that's been asked for from R&D, but at this point, it's not functioning.
Okay, and we've had a few questions if there would ever be a tilt shift adapter for the X series.
I have to say this is probably the most requested item for the X system cameras. It's been fed back to the development team, and they've heard the message loud and clear. So yeah, let's see what comes. But basically, they understand it is a requirement.
Okay, that's good. And then also on extension tubes as well. And do we have any options for extension tubes on X at the moment?
Yes, so basically extension tubes, again, is a message internally that's been fed back to R&D, and they understand that, you know, effectively we need the same as we had for the H camera in terms of, you know, 2 or 3 different sizes of extension tube, especially as with the XCD 120, it's a half-life size, not a 1-to-1, so we know that. I have to say that there are third-party extension tubes out there for X system cameras. So a quick search on the internet, you'll find those. And again, because it's a basic, just a spacer, there should be no issues with that, but they are available through third party.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I think that's around it for now. We've got a few more coming in, but if we crack on with the next section, and I'll collate some more questions for later.
Cool. Okay. So I jump into leaf shutters, or a speciality, obviously, Hasselblad leaf shutters. So before we do that, a quick overview of shutters in general. So probably everybody's used to focal plane shutter. So you have moving blinds in the camera body, could be 2 or more, or these days could be 1 mechanical shutter blind. Generally, there is a limitation on the maximum speed that can be used while this whole sensor is exposed to the light. Okay, so that used to be around 200th, 250th of a second, sometimes slightly quicker, maybe 1/320th, something like that. But generally, compared to the maximum speed of the mechanical shutter, it was quite slow. Leaf shutters, central lens shutters, because of the way that they work in terms of a radial movement, it's built into every lens and basically means that you can have flash sync at all shutter speeds, because the shutter opens fully for all shutter speeds. The slight downside, if you like, is that the maximum speed that can be achieved with a leaf shutter is generally 1 to 2 stops at least slower than the maximum speed on a focal plane shutter. So if we take XCD lenses, so we've got 1/2000th of a second, whereas mechanical shutters or with a focal plane design could be 1/4000th, 1/8000th. These days also there is the option of electronic shutters, and with CMOS sensors now, the global shutters are becoming more and more prevalent, and the readout speeds from global shutters, especially with smaller, full frame 36x24 type sensors, the readout speeds for there, you can literally use the global shutter as opposed to a mechanical shutter. Again, the readout speeds can be very, very quick and can give you shutter speeds of 10,000th of a second. Unfortunately for the medium format sensors that are currently available, the readout speeds are longer than smaller sensors, and it's not a global shutter. So you get the rolling shutter effects if you're not careful with any movement within the frame, and that's purely because of the time it can take to read out. So for instance, our 50 megapixel sensor takes around 300 milliseconds to read from top to bottom. So it doesn't sound too long, but it's enough for any movement to show up as weird rolling shutter effects. So the main issue in terms of flash exposure, so a focal plane shutter at slower speeds, no problem, the whole sensor is exposed at the same time. As you increase the speeds, the gap between the blinds gets smaller and smaller, so that smaller portion of the sensor is exposed at any one time, which means if you're unlucky to be using flash, you can end up with some basic areas of the image that don't get any flash exposure. Okay, so that's a slight downside there. However, leaf shutters are obviously different. So if we talk about the leaf shutters in our lenses, other companies have them as well, but all Hasselblad lenses use leaf shutters. Okay, that's HC, HCD, and XCD. The plus point is that you can use flash at any speed at all. So whatever the lens will accept, so it could be 500th, 1000th, 2000th, you can use flash. You don't need to worry about what speed am I at. And you don't need any high-speed sync equipment. So you can literally just use your standard flash, trigger it as normal through the hot shoe or a cable, and basically you can then sync with whatever speed you want. The plus point of that is that you've got the full power of the flash available to you, where if you're using high-speed sync with multiple flashes, effectively the total power per flash has to drop down to cope with that. So this means you can have the full power of your flash pack or speed light is fully available to you. So in terms of what they are, what they look like, and so on, so this is one of our XCD lens shutters, just to give you an idea. And generally, we have two sizes depending on the lens. So the smaller lenses, things like the 45p and so on, they have this much smaller shutter unit, because obviously the lens itself is smaller. We don't need a massive unit. Obviously, once you go up to something like the 80, 1.9 and so on, that needs the larger shutter unit to cope with the actual wider lens body. But in terms of movement, you can see the range that we have here. From fully closed, it opens up through to fully open, and then it reverses. So gives you the whole movement is here. Normally, we would have a few more blades than that, but this is just a diagram to give you that idea. Advantages, because the shutter is moving radially out or in, all of the, if you like, inherent vibration that the movement would give you is spread out. It's equalized out. So one side's going left, one side's going right, up, down, and so the pressures equalize out in terms of any vibration. It also means that the camera body can be smaller. We don't need to leave space in front of the sensor to mount a shutter unit. There is a slight cost disadvantage there, because when we physically build a lens, we have to take it into account that the shutter itself has to fit into the lens body, and there's a cost for that shutter in every single lens body. Even our entry-level lenses, we have to take into account the cost of a leaf shutter unit inside. A slight operational disadvantage also is that leaf shutters generally don't have that ultra fast speed. Even though the blade movement is fast, we can't achieve, you know, the 8,000th of a second shutter times that you can on a mechanical shutter. Okay. Going to move on to a final thing in terms of leaf shutters, not specific to Hasselblad, but something that we handle internally with a true exposure correction. So as the leaf shutter physically opens and closes, depending on what aperture you're using, the exposure actually can be longer or shorter, depending on which aperture. And so true exposure mode, which is within the camera menu, compensates for the fact that the effective exposure is longer at smaller apertures. Now, you can think of that as the shutter opens, if you're down at f11, you've got a small aperture hole. As the shutter opens, the exposure is there, and then the shutter opens fully and then starts to close after the exposure time. But effectively, it's got a lot of movement where it's not covering the aperture hole. So you've got an extended exposure time. If I was on a 2.8 aperture, literally the time starts when the shutter is fully open, and then the exposure is stopped as it starts to close. So you can see by shooting wide open, you've got direct control. Hasselblad understands that, understands the way that this affects our exposure. And so true exposure mode's put in, the camera automatically will modify the shutter speed selected to compensate for that exposure change. Okay. That's perfectly acceptable in terms of delivering you the aperture you've selected and the shutter speed that you've had to give you a correct exposure. If we're shooting with flash, obviously changing the shutter speed as such has no effect on a flash exposure. It's primarily the aperture which determines the flash part of the exposure. We run into a problem, however, if you're trying to shoot with the maximum, or so should I say, the shortest speed available. So for instance, if I was trying to shoot with flash at 1,000th of a second, and that's the maximum speed that I can actually select, the system has no more shorter shutter speed to move to. And so what happens there is it does the next best thing according to the camera. It decides to modify the aperture. And so with this, that would then affect a flash exposure. So that's why if you look into the manuals or some of the online material, it recommends turning off true exposure if you're trying to shoot at the fastest shutter speed of the lens with flash. Otherwise, it can be left on. So this is just a way for Hasselblad to control the exposure subtleties that a leaf shutter has. Okay. Any questions, Mark?
Yes, yeah, we've got a few questions.
Okay.
So there's a question from Shane relating to the sort of the life of a lens shutter,
Okay.
leaf shutter. And what's the another question also on the servicing? So what do we recommend in terms of servicing leaf shutters?
Okay, so XED lenses and the latest, so the orange square exposure units that are inside the Hasselblad H System lenses. So they are pretty much, 3 million plus exposures is what we would expect to get out of those. But in terms of, servicing and looking after it, if it's your main source of income, or you're really heavily using your lenses, it's probably worth getting them checked or serviced, overhauled at least every couple of years. If it's real heavy use, maybe every year. That's what we would recommend, just to get the system checked out. But for general users, maybe not shooting as many exposures, you shouldn't need to worry about that. Yeah, if you want to get it checked every 3-4 years, then fine, give it an overhaul. But generally, the exposure units in the XED lenses and so on now, they are a lot more, should we say, lifespan expected of them.
Okay. Also another question. So in this sort of new era of mirrorless cameras, why do we still have a need for mechanical shutter? Will it ever disappear?
I would say longer term, very probably, but at this point, as I sort of mentioned a little bit earlier, the readout time for a medium format sensor is too long. And so if you're trying to capture a moving subject with electronic shutter mode, we end up getting rolling shutter effects. As I say, the 50 megapixel is around 300 milliseconds to go from top to bottom. And even though that sounds quite short, it is a long time if you're trying to capture a moving subject. With the way technology is moving forward, I would fully expect to see the very fast readout times that we're seeing in the 36-24 type sensor migrating through to the medium format sensors. So at this point, that is why we still need a mechanical sensor to use high speeds and to ensure we don't get that rolling shutter effect.
Okay, great. Richard is asking why the number of blades in the shutter. So why so few? I think the question was. So we use 4 blades. Is that right?
It varies on the shutter unit and the lens, to be honest. So if it's a really small lens, we can use the smallest exposure unit, which has fewer blades. So something like the XED 45P, if you look there, it has very few blades, but then it's such a tiny lens, we don't need 8 blades. Normally, more blades gives you a nicer bokeh effect. So the outer focus sort of highlight detail in the background gives you a nicer, rounder, not so harsh looking effect. But generally, we have as many blades as we need for that size shutter unit or exposure unit. So as I say, we have at least 2 sizes generally, depending on whether it's, as I say, the 80mm 1.9 or whether we're talking something like the the 21 or so on. So we have different shutters for different lenses, basically.
Okay. And Jeffrey's asking about using the H extension tubes with the XH adapters. Is that a possibility?
Yes, you can do that. Yeah, again, because they're generally pass through. They're literally just a dumb spacer, and the signals will pass through, no problem.
Okay. Another question is in regard to the XED 45P lens.
Oh, okay.
And the question is in regard to the lower price point of the lens. So the assumption that it doesn't have a leaf shutter, but it does, I believe.
Yes, it does. Yeah. So basically, every one of our lenses has a leaf shutter. The 45P has the fewest blades of all, basically, but it is still a leaf shutter, which means we've got access to, as I say, flash sync at all speeds. But again, if you look at the size of the 45p, the actual optical elements on it, it's so small that there's no point putting a 6 or an 8 blade leaf shutter in there. It's a complete waste of money. So I believe it's 2 blades we have in the 45p, but that will still give us enough of the effect, leaf shutter effect, to get the benefit.
Okay. And what is the future for shutters and adapters as well? Like you already hinted about, maybe in the future would we need a mechanical shutter, but is there any sort of room for advancements in the future?
Yeah, well, I think currently the problem with electronic shutter modes on a lot of cameras is that the flash sync is not available when using electronic shutter mode. So for instance, if we look at our X1D 50 megapixel sensor, you can't use flash even at a short shutter speed because effectively the sensor starts to get read out line by line. The flash exposure has been and finished before it's got halfway down the sensor, so therefore the readout time is a big problem. Now, going forward into the future, those readout times are going to get shorter and shorter and shorter, and you're going to have a global shutter effect. So currently, the sensors are read out line by line. Once a global shutter moves to medium format and we can read out in one go, then sure, mechanical shutters won't be needed, because even with flash, you'll be able to use electronic shutter mode. But at the current point, with the sensors available, we have no choice. We have to use a mechanical shutter to be able to use flash.
Yeah. Okay. A question from Jean-Philippe. What is the reaction time of a leaf shutter? So the time between triggering and the actual image being taken. I guess that depends on the shutter speed.
Yeah, and it's not just that. It's the total system reaction time, because from when you press the shutter, you've then got the system reaction, and then the exposure takes place. So for instance, with a leaf shutter, the shutter has to close first, then it opens to start the exposure and then closes. So you've got an additional time for a leaf shutter to close compared to, if we're talking a focal plane shutter here, it can start exposing straight away. The first curtain starts to move and the exposure is taking place. You've not got a closing that needs to play. So in terms of comparing the two, a focal plane shutter is, I have to say, marginally faster at reacting to an exposure request. You've still got that time between pressing the button and that request being made as well. So it could vary even between, the same type of shutter on different cameras could be a different amount of time.
Okay. Another question from Richard in regard to the blades of the shutter. Does it affect the aperture of the image, the number of blades you have?
No, so basically it's just the number of blades will affect the time. So if you've got more blades to actually get in and get to the size that you're after, it could be that it's better to more quickly move a smaller blade than having 3 or 4 larger blades, which take a bit more, they've got more inertia. You need more energy to move them. So it's more a case of what's most energy efficient in terms of the number of blades. You'll still have the aperture. Now, obviously within X System cameras, you have the option of switching on and off the option of a circular aperture. So you can go for a full true circular or go for the hexagonal effect. So depending on what you like in terms of that out of focus effect. So that is an option within the X camera menu.
Okay. And a question from Taylor. Sorry, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but he's asking, can we talk about the tripod mount in use with the adapters? Because with a large lens and extension tubes, there's a lot of weight and pressure on the adapter and the camera.
Yes.
So yeah, we have a tripod mount adapter, don't we, that fits to the...
Exactly. So that's designed to basically fit over the adapter, and that will allow you to use, let's say the 120 or even the 150 or 210 HC lenses on that, and it means that you can have the body weight off to one side of the adapter. Yes, obviously you've got a lot of weight on the adapter itself, but they are built to be able to take that. You know, if you were trying to fit the 300 HC 300 millimeter, that has its own tripod adapter, and effectively you would then put the body with the XH adapter onto that. So that's stronger because the 300 is much bigger. But you know, the 210, the 150, quite happily, and even the 120, quite happy to go with the tripod adapter attached to your XH or 0.8 converter, no problem.
Okay. Question from Ralph Ingo. Why do you not see darker edges if you use a leaf shutter? Is it corrected in the software? So this is the true exposure again, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And also, so yeah, you know, the center, if you like, gets the full exposure on a leaf shutter, and then as it opens, the edges are then, if you like, slightly darker. But that's very simple. That's just standard fall off vignetting type correction. That's very easily corrected through lens corrections.
Okay. And question from Albert. I think you probably missed the beginning, but they're asking about the use of the H tilt shift adapter on the X camera with the X8 adapter. So this was one of the topics that I mentioned at the beginning that was covered in our previous X system. But if you could just cover it quickly.
Yeah, no problem. So you can physically mount, you know, let's assume I've got the 50 millimeter HC lens and I've mounted it onto the HTS, which I then put onto one of the adapters or converters. I would recommend that you use it with the 0.8 converter, because the HTS gives you a 1.5 times magnification increase anyway. So if you were using the standard XH adapter, you've got even more of an increase. So to get some of that back, I would suggest using the 0.8 converter. But you can use it. Obviously, it is adding more and more of an extension. Again, for me, I would probably then use that tripod mount adapter to hold the 0.8 converter, and then I've got my HTS and so on. What you need to remember is that when used with an X camera, none of the correction information is recorded into the frame. That functionality is not enabled. And so effectively you need to use the HTS live, so correct it, maybe take a few sample images to make sure you're getting the effect that you want, but no information will be recorded in the metadata of the captures. So you won't be able to go back and say, oh, that was, you know, 10 mil shift or whatever. That will not be stored.
Okay. Question from Georges. With V lenses, the slow speeds of leaf shutters start with time to increase. Is that the same with the newer leaf shutters in the HCD and XCD leaf shutters? So I think that's a question regarding, you know, is the speed of the shutters faster in the faster cameras, in the newer lenses?
Yeah, so obviously, if you look at V system lenses, so you basically had 500th of a second was generally the fastest speed available, and then that went down to, you know, a few seconds, and then you could then have a bulb and so on as an option. With H system, the original lenses that came out for HC and HCD had an 800th of a second, and then back in 2016 we overhauled all of the exposure units and went to the orange square lenses, which boosted it to 1,000th of a second or 2,000th of a second, depending on what camera you were using. So that was an increase there. XCD lenses came in, and again, all of the shutters were overhauled to give them, you know, a smaller, lighter characteristic, and so therefore we had 2,000th of a second in terms of that maximum speed. So every time we've developed new lens systems, every time we do an overhaul, we try to boost that sort of shortest shutter speed. Even if it's just one more stop, we try to push it.
Okay. We've got a couple of questions regarding the tripod mount adapter that we just spoke about. I don't suppose you've got a quick image of it available, have you, or not? Or if not, you know, people can all go to our website and do a search for it on there as the X System accessories. You'll be able to see it on there. Is it something you've got handy, Chris, or not?
If you like, I can, if I stop the show, 1 second. And you know it won't be available.
Just quickly while we're waiting, I've got another question from Tony. So he's saying he's got an old H system lens that doesn't support autofocusing.
Yep.
So he's asking whether it would be worth him therefore buying one of the new XCD lenses. So I guess the answer there is how valuable the autofocus is to him and the way he works.
Yeah, I think you've got to look at it like that, because autofocus obviously is nice, but if you've already got the lens and you know you're the type of photographer you are, maybe a product photographer or something like that, still life, then AF's not really a major thing. You've got the focal length, and that's the important thing. So I'll just bring up this. Right.
Got another question while we're waiting, Chris. Oh, there we go.
Yep. So that's your bracket X8. So that's your tripod adapter. So that specific size there is designed to fit the 0.8 converter, the X8 adapter, and so on.
Okay. And then another question from Jeffrey. So he's asking if all HCD lenses are able to autofocus. So we know that they're not, and it depends on that firmware version for their hardware specification. But when buying second-hand lenses, I guess you would have to ask the seller to inform you of the firmware version before you buy, as to whether it'll be compatible or not.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're going in store, you could literally take your camera and the adapter and mount the lens, and it will tell you. Or you could ask the store owner, can you please tell me what firmware version that? Because normally, you know, they can even tell you things like shutter count and so on if you ask them. So.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's pretty much it for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for your questions. Thank you, Chris, for taking the time out of your day over there, and we'll let you get on now and have a fika break.
No problem.
Yeah. So I'm just going to wrestle the presentation back to share the last few slides.
Have you got it?
Yep, there we go. Yeah, so just to finish up, as I say, thanks for joining us again today. And when you exit the webinar, you should see a feedback form that comes up. It'd be great if you're able to help us by filling that in. It helps us to understand what people like about the webinars and what we can maybe do differently. So that's all very much appreciated if you could take the time to do that. Also, another reminder that our past webinars are on our Hasselblad YouTube channel. So by registering for our webinars, you get access to the full recording on our YouTube channel a few hours after the webinar. So today's webinar will hopefully be up either later tonight or tomorrow morning. And also all the previous webinars that we've done over the past few years, covering lots of different topics and interviews with different photographers. And then finally, for more information on Hasselblad, of course, you can visit the Hasselblad website at hasselblad.com. On there, we've got everything about our future webinars and events, lots on our products, our partner network around the world, lots of inspiration with stories and images, lots on our history, and you can also request a demo and any support that you may need. Yes, so thanks very much for joining us, and hope to see you again on our next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.